This four-part course of instruction provides port facility and ship operator personnel with a comprehensive review of the history of maritime terrorism, crime, and piracy, with a view towards identifying relevant trends for the industry. Upon completion of this program, the student will appreciate the fundamental elements required to perform a threat assessment for either a port or ship. The four parts of this program are Introduction to the Threat, History and Current Trends in Maritime Terrorism, Current Security Threat and Patterns in Maritime Crime and Piracy, and Introduction to Port and Ship Operations and Security Measures.
Moxie Media and C-Secure present An Introduction to Maritime Security and Anti-Terrorism, part of the Maritime Security and Operations Training Series designed to meet the training requirements of the International Maritime Organization's International Ship and Port Facility Code and the United States Maritime Security Act of 2002. This four-part training program begins with Introduction to the Threat.
The C-Secure Maritime Security Operations Management course provides senior port facility and ship security personnel with the necessary background and tools necessary to comply with the mandatory training requirements set forth in the International Maritime Organization's International Ship and Port Facility Security Code. This course will prepare the graduate to effectively discharge the duties of a port facility security officer, company security officer, and ship security officer, as well as providing important domain knowledge to port state control officers, recognized security organization auditors, and other maritime security professionals. The Maritime Security Operations Management course will explore theoretical and historical maritime security concerns, as well as the practical applications of the ISPS code and other related regulations, including those associated with the United States Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002. However, despite the skills that will be achieved in the course, it will be incumbent upon the graduate to acquire practical hands-on skills that will be essential for meeting the stringent and essential professional requirements these positions require. Competencies to be achieved in the Maritime Security Operations course will include those that will provide specific competencies to the graduate that are either mandated by the ISPS code and or other regulations or recommended by best industry practices. The expected learning outcome for each student will include familiarization and understanding of maritime terrorism and crime, vulnerabilities of seaports and ships, maritime security policy, security responsibilities of government and industry, security assessments for ships and seaports, security equipment, security plans for ships and seaports, searches, identification and response to dangerous weapons, etc., security actions and protocols, emergency preparedness. This course provides an introduction to the relevant international conventions, codes, legislation, and regulations associated with maritime security. The many resolutions and conventions that have been adopted by the International Maritime Organization in order to prevent, deter, and mitigate threats to security and maritime transportation are discussed, providing a historical perspective on the development of and the objectives within the ISPS code. In addition to a discussion of the ISPS code, the student will also learn about national maritime security measures, including the United States Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002, MTSA, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, CTPAT, and the Container Security Initiative, CSI. In order to fully appreciate the complexities of these maritime security policies, the program will provide key definitions and clarifications of terms found in SOLAS Chapter 11-2, Regulation 1, and in the ISPS Code Part A, Section 2. Finally, the student will hear about the potential legal implications of action or non-action by the Port Facility Security Officer and Ship Security Officer, as well as the requirements associated with the handling of sensitive security-related information and communications.
For the sake of continuity, the terminology used throughout these tapes will be that provided in the IMO's International Ship and Port Facility Security ISPS code. For those users who are regulated by the U.S. Maritime Transportation Security Act, MTSA, of 2002, you should be aware of some differences in nomenclature between equivalent ISPS code and MTSA positions and functions. You should keep the following in mind when listening to these tapes. The ISPS code refers to ports, facilities, and ships, while the MTSA refers to facilities and vessels. ISPS code Port Facility Security Assessments, PFSA, and Port Facility Security Plans, PFSP, are, in the terminology of the MTSA, Facility Security Assessments, FSA, and Facility Security Plans, FSP. Likewise, ISPS code Ship Security Assessments, SSA, and Ship Security Plans, SSP, are equivalent to MTSA Vessel Security Assessments, VSA, and Vessel Security Plans, VSP. While reference to the company's security officer, CSO, remains the same in both the ISPS code and MTSA, under the MTSA, the ISPS code Ship Security Officer, SSO, becomes the Vessel Security Officer, VSO, and the Port Facility Security Officer, PFSO, is equivalent to a Facility Security Officer, FSO. It is important to remember that despite differences in the nomenclature used to identify procedures, documents, or key personnel, the requirements for conducting assessments based on credible threats, generating plans based on the findings of those assessments, and providing required and recommended training to all appropriate personnel remain the same for both the ISPS code and the MTSA.
Welcome to this portion of the Maritime Security Operations Management course. This is part 2, where we're going to be discussing maritime security policy. Under maritime security policy, let's first discuss the ISPS code, because that is the overarching requirement that all of us in the maritime field need to understand. The International Maritime Organization has adopted the following resolutions and conventions in an attempt to minimize, stop, or otherwise control threats to security in maritime transportation. Resolution A 545, Section 13, Measures to Prevent Acts of Piracy and Armed Robbery Against Ships, which was signed in 1983. Resolution A 584, Section 14, Measures to Prevent Unlawful Acts which Threaten Safety of Ships and Security of Passengers, which was signed in 1985. In 1986, the IMO approved MSC Circular 443, Measures to Prevent Acts against Passengers and Crew on board ships. In 1988 came the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation, also known as SUA. SUA was aimed at ensuring that appropriate judicial action is taken against persons committing unlawful acts against ships, which would include the seizure of ships by force, acts of violence against persons on board ships, and placing devices on board ship. Following the tragic events in New York and Washington on September 11, 2001, the IMO, in November of 2001, unanimously agreed to the development of new measures relating to the security of ships and port facilities for adoption by a conference of contracting governments to the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, in 1974. And in December 2002, otherwise known as the Diplomatic Conference, these actions were in fact voted upon and agreed to. This diplomatic conference resulted in amendments to SOLAS 74. The following lists the sections to which the amendments were made. These amendments enter into force on July 1, 2004. Chapter 5, Chapter 11, Regulations 3 and 5, Chapters 11-2, which is a new chapter, Regulations 1 through 13, and of course the ISPS code itself. The objectives of the ISPS code are simple. Number 1, to establish an international framework involving cooperation between contracting governments, government agencies, local administrations, and the shipping and port industries to detect security threats and to take preventative measures against security incidents affecting ships or port facilities used in international trade. Number 2, to establish the respective roles and responsibilities of the contracting governments, government agencies, local administrations, and the shipping and port industries at the national and international level for ensuring maritime security. 3, to ensure the early and efficient collection and exchange of security-related information. 4, to provide a methodology for security assessments so as to have in place plans and procedures to react to changing security levels. And 5, to ensure confidence that adequate and proportionate maritime security measures are in place. Let's look at some of the relevant government legislation and regulations here at home. Several governments have acted
on a national level to produce legislative and/or regulations concerned with measures to enhance maritime security. The United States, for example, has developed the Maritime Transportation Security Act, MTSA, as well as the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, CTPAT, and the Container Security Initiative as definitive combatants against potential threats posed to the transportation infrastructure. These legislative acts and regulations are part of a comprehensive response to threats directed at the critical transportation infrastructure of the U.S. The intended purpose of these aggressive actions on the part of the United States government is to provide appropriate national security for the protection of the infrastructure and to facilitate the implementation of the international counterpart, the ISPS code, by providing a platform on which to build impenetrable security systems that incorporate both national and international standards. Key features of the MTSA are requirements for port facility and vulnerability security assessments, preparation by the Secretary of Transportation of a National Maritime Transportation Security Plan and area plans for each U.S. Coast Guard Captain of the Port's zone, development of security plans for certain facilities and commercial vessels, the issuance and use of transportation security cards, ID cards, for personnel whose responsibilities require them to access secure spaces aboard ships, the establishment of a permanent program of grants to facilitate the enhancement of maritime security, assessment by the Secretary of Transportation of the effectiveness of anti-terrorism measures at foreign ports, and this is probably going to be carried out by inspection teams that will be analogous to those that are inspecting foreign airports as part of the FAA's measures to ensure that international requirements are being met. And you'll notice that at some airports you'll still see signs that say that flights into or out of Lagos from the United States are prohibited because of the security conditions that were identified during.
This course is intended to give students an appreciation of the maritime security system conceived by the IMO and to demonstrate how the various entities will work together, the relative roles of contracting governments, recognized security organizations, the company security officer, the ship security officer, the port facility security officer, and other vessel and port security personnel are also discussed. Specific information is provided on contracting governments, RSOs, shipping companies, ships, port facilities, as well as those persons with specific security responsibilities.
For the sake of continuity, the terminology used throughout these tapes will be that provided in the IMO's International Ship and Port Facility Security ISPS code. For those users who are regulated by the U.S. Maritime Transportation Security Act, MTSA of 2002, you should be aware of some differences in nomenclature between equivalent ISPS code and MTSA positions and functions. You should keep the following in mind when listening to these tapes. The ISPS code refers to ports, facilities, and ships, while the MTSA refers to facilities and vessels. ISPS code Port Facility Security Assessments, PFSA, and Port Facility Security Plans, PFSP, are, in the terminology of the MTSA, Facility Security Assessments, FSA, and Facility Security Plans, FSP. Likewise, ISPS code Ship Security Assessments, SSA, and Ship Security Plans, SSP, are equivalent to MTSA Vessel Security Assessments, VSA, and Vessel Security Plans, VSP. While reference to the company's security officer, CSO, remains the same in both the ISPS code and MTSA, under the MTSA, the ISPS code Ship Security Officer, SSO, becomes the Vessel Security Officer, VSO, and the Port Facility Security Officer, PFSO, is equivalent to a Facility Security Officer, FSO. It is important to remember that despite differences in the nomenclature used to identify procedures, documents, or key personnel, the requirements for conducting assessments based on credible threats, generating plans based on the findings of those assessments, and providing required and recommended training to all appropriate personnel remain the same for both the ISPS code and the MTSA.
In this program, we will review the security responsibilities of contracting governments and those charged with implementing and enforcing the elements found within the ISPS code. Some of the terms of reference used in this program include the contracting government, the Declaration of Security, the Recognized Security Organization, or RSO, the company or shipping company, the company security officer, or CSO, the ship security officer, or SSO, the port facility, and finally the Port Facility Security Officer, or PFSO. First, let's discuss the role of the contracting government. For details on this, please refer to the ISPS Code's Part A, Chapter 4. As a definition, a contracting government means the government within whose territory the port facility is located. Contracting governments are responsible for setting security levels and providing guidance for the protection from various security incidents. Factors for the contracting government to consider when setting security levels include the degree that threat information is credible, the degree that threat information is corroborated, the degree that threat information is specific or imminent, and the potential consequences of such a security incident. Throughout this course, you may hear us refer to either a security level or a MARSEC level. The terms are interchangeable, with security level being applied in reference to the ISPS code and MARSEC, or Maritime Security Level, being used by the United States government. A requirement of the ISPS code is that when a contracting government sets a security level, or MARSEC level, to 3, the highest level available and implying a potentially imminent threat, the contracting government must issue appropriate instructions and provide security-related information to the ships and port facilities that may be affected. It is understood that not all governments will have the necessary expertise or experience necessary to cope with every aspect of the ISPS code and/or its obligations. A contracting government may decide to delegate either a recognized security organization, or RSO, or other expert consultant to handle certain of their security-related duties. The exception to these duties are specific and include setting of the applicable security level, approving a port facility security assessment and subsequent amendments of an approved assessment, determining the port facilities which will be required to designate a port facility security officer, approving a port facility security plan and subsequent amendments to an approved plan, exercising control and compliance measures pursuant to applicable international and national requirements, establishing the requirements for a declaration of security. Contracting governments shall, to the extent they consider it appropriate, test the effectiveness of ship or port facility security plans, as well as amendments to such plans. In the case of ships, they must test those plans that have been approved on their behalf by a duly authorized RSO. It's important to understand the concept of the Declaration of Security as well. It's also known as the DOS, and it is an important element between ships and both ports or other ships. For more information on this, please refer to the ISPS Code's Part A, Chapter 5. Contracting governments are obliged to determine when a declaration of security is required by assessing the risk of the ship-port interface or ship-to-ship activities posed to persons, property, or the environment. The DOS is essentially an agreement between a ship and either a port or other ship. The DOS stipulates, by agreement between the parties, what their respective duties are with regard to security arrangements intended to protect both parties. For example, a ship can request the completion of a declaration of security when the ship is operating at a higher security level than the port facility or another ship it is interfacing with. If there is an agreement on a declaration of security between contracting governments covering certain international voyages or specific ships on those voyages. When there has been a security threat or security incident involving the ship or the port facility. When the ship is at a port which is not required to have an approved port facility security plan, or when the ship is conducting ship-to-ship activities with another ship not required to have an approved ship security plan. Such requests for the completion of a declaration of security must be acknowledged by the applicable port facility or ship. The declaration of security must be completed by the ship's master or the ship security officer, the Port Facility Security Officer, or if the contracting government determines otherwise, by any other body responsible for shoreside security on behalf of the port facility. The Declaration of Security must address security requirements that may be shared between a port facility and a ship, or between ships, and should stay. In this program, the ideas, plans, and preparations explored and developed in the previous courses are put into practice, and appropriate procedures are developed to facilitate security actions. The actions associated with a change in security levels are discussed, and the importance of maintaining security at the ship-port interface is stressed. In addition, the appropriate use of the Declaration of Security is conveyed.
For the sake of continuity, the terminology used throughout these tapes will be that provided in the IMO's International Ship and Port Facility Security ISPS code. For those users who are regulated by the U.S. Maritime Transportation Security Act, MTSA, of 2002, you should be aware of some differences in nomenclature between equivalent ISPS code and MTSA positions and functions. You should keep the following in mind when listening to these tapes. The ISPS code refers to ports, facilities, and ships, while the MTSA refers to facilities and vessels. ISPS code Port Facility Security Assessments, PFSA, and Port Facility Security Plans, PFSP, are, in the terminology of the MTSA, Facility Security Assessments, FSA, and Facility Security Plans, FSP. Likewise, ISPS code Ship Security Assessments, SSA, and Ship Security Plans, SSP, are equivalent to MTSA Vessel Security Assessments, VSA, and Vessel Security Plans, VSP. While reference to the company's security officer, CSO, remains the same in both the ISPS code and MTSA, under the MTSA, the ISPS code Ship Security Officer, SSO, becomes the Vessel Security Officer, VSO, and the Port Facility Security Officer, PFSO, is equivalent to a Facility Security Officer, FSO. It is important to remember that despite differences in the nomenclature used to identify procedures, documents, or key personnel, the requirements for conducting assessments based on credible threats, generating plans based on the findings of those assessments, and providing required and recommended training to all appropriate personnel remain the same for both the ISPS code and the MTSA.
In this course, we will explore those specific actions that ships and seaports should take under the various security level or MARSEC levels that each contracting government will be responsible for setting. It is important to remember that the specific actions that must be taken by either the port or the ship be spelled out clearly in the security plan. Remember, ideas, plans, and preparations are first developed and then put into action. The response actions taken will always be contingent upon the declared security level of the ship or port. Also, security levels are established by the vessel and contracting government. First, the basics. There are 3 different levels of security. Security level or MARSEC level 1 is the lowest security level. MARSEC, of course, stands for Maritime Security and is pertinent in the United States. Security level or MARSEC level 2. And then there's security level or MARSEC level 3, which is the highest security level. Let's talk about each individually. Security level or MARSEC level 1 is a normal level of security. Part A of the ISPS code describes this as the level for which minimum appropriate protective security measures shall be maintained at all times. Part B of the ISPS code goes on to say that this is the level at which ships and port facilities normally operate under. Not much of a difference, really. Security level or MARSEC level 2 is a heightened level of security. In Part A of the code, it says that this is the level for which appropriate additional protective security measures shall be maintained for a period of time as a result of heightened risk of a security incident. In Part B of the code, it says that this is the level that applies for as long as there is a heightened risk of a security incident. Security level or MARSEC level 3 is an exceptional level of security. Now, let's look at Part A of the ISPS code. Here it says that this is the level for which Further specific protective security measures must be maintained for a limited period of time when a security incident is probable or imminent, although it may not be possible to identify the specific target. In Part B of the Code, it says that the level applies for the period of time when there is the probable or imminent risk of a security incident. Let's take a look at some of the requirements associated with these different security levels. First, let's discuss ship access controls. Under Security Level or MARSEC Level 1, the ship security officer must check and confirm the identity of all persons accessing the ship. Remember, this is what you're going to do under normal conditions. Also, the SSO must designate the areas where searches and screenings can be performed. Also, there has to be provisions for monitoring restricted areas. The SSO should also ensure that vehicles, cargo, and passengers are subjected to search and screening. This applies obviously to ferries as well as to passenger ships. Also, the SSO should segregate screened passengers from unchecked passengers. In addition, the SSO must secure unattended adjacent areas that passengers have access to. He or she must provide security briefings to ship personnel, review possible threats to the ship, report suspicious persons, objects, or activities to the port and/or the contracting government. Finally, the SSO should underscore the need for vigilance to the crew and any visitors on board. For port facility access controls under Security or MARSEC Level 1, you have similar requirements. Restricted areas should be bound by fencing or other barriers. Check and confirm the identity of all persons accessing the port. Check vehicles entering and exiting the port. Verify the identification of all persons entering the port and confirm the access authority of vehicles of port personnel and individuals employed within the port. Because remember, you don't want anyone coming in with a vehicle, only persons that are authorized to bring that vehicle into the port. The Port Facility Security Officer should also restrict access to individuals with proper identification. And finally, you should identify and secure access points that are not in regular use. Now, let's see what happens to ship access controls under Security Level 2. First, you should assign additional personnel to patrol routes. Limit and secure the number of access points onto the ship. Deter waterside access to the vessel. Establish a restricted area on the quay or shoreside. Increase the frequency and scope of searches of vehicles, cargo, and passengers. Escort all visitors on board the ship. Provide additional security briefings to ship personnel. Further review any possible threats to the ship. Also, report suspicious persons, objects, or activities to the proper authorities. Continue to underscore the need for vigilance, and finally perform a full or partial search of the ship. Now, for port facility access controls under Security Level or MARSEC Level 2, and we'll just mention Security Level from now on, you need to assign additional personnel to guard access points and patrol the perimeter. You must limit and secure the number of access points. Install sufficient security obstacles and barriers, particularly against unauthorized vehicle access. Increase the frequency and scope of searches of vehicles, cargo, and passengers. Restrict access to individuals with proper identification. And finally, use patrol vessels to enhance waterside security. Now, let's look at ship access controls when we move further up the scale to Security Level 3. Here, you have to limit access to a single controlled entry and access point. For example, you may typically have a gangway that is used for both crew and passengers, and a second gangway that's used just for passengers. Under this threat condition, you may want to limit yourself to a single gangway entering onto and off of the ship. Allow access to This course will draw upon Part B of the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code and Appendix B to demonstrate to port facility security officers, company security officers, and ship security officers the administrative requirements for both documentation and records keeping. Records associated with the security assessment and security plan, as well as training, drills, and maintenance of security equipment and systems are vital in order to achieve and maintain certification of compliance with the ISPS code. The essential elements of this program include ISPS requirements associated with documentation and records, reporting of security incidents, monitoring and control of the security plan, security audits and inspections, and the reporting of nonconformities. It's essential for you to understand the ISPS Code's expectations for the administration of ship and port security programs. The course objectives for this program are for you to be able to identify required documentation and records that must be available at all times, identify ports that are required to be issued a statement of compliance, the International Ship Security Certification Program. When are they valid, and what are the verification requirements? You need to understand the requirements for security personnel to carry out regular security inspections, and how to identify the requirements of the Continuous Synopsis Record, or CSR, and what it must contain. To recognize the importance of reporting all security incidents in an appropriate and efficient manner. To understand the qualifications necessary for the receipt of an International Ship Security Certificate, and to understand the requirements for carrying out internal audits and inspections. Remember that all security incidents must be reported in accordance with specific reporting requirements. Some examples might be if an intruder makes their way past a security perimeter fence into a port, or if a ship were to find a stowaway on board. Documentation and records are a vital part of the ISPS Code. Much like the ISM Code, or International Safety Management Code, there is an emphasis on the ability to audit activities to ensure compliance with all portions of the ISPS Code. One of the important elements of the ISPS Code is the requirement for a continuous synopsis record, as detailed in SOLAS Chapter 11-2, Regulation 5. Every ship subject to the ISPS Code must be issued with a Continuous Synopsis Record, or CSR. The CSR is intended to provide an onboard record of the history of the ship with respect to the information recorded therein. The CSR must contain at least the following information: the name of the registered bareboat charterer or charterers and their registered addresses, the name of the ship company, the name of all classification societies with which the ship is classified, the name of the administration or of the contracting government or of the recognized organization which has issued the document of compliance, the name of the administration or of the contracting government or of the recognized organization that has issued the safety management certificate, the name of the administration or of the contracting government or of the recognized security organization that has issued the International Ship Security Certificate, and the date on which the ship ceased to be registered with that state. There are additional documentation and records requirements that the company must undertake apart from those associated with the Continuous Synopsis Recorder. For example, the company must ensure that the master has available on board at all times information through which officers duly authorized by a contracting government can establish who is responsible for appointing the members of the crew, who is responsible for deciding the employment of the ship. In cases where the ship is employed under the terms of charter parties, who are the parties to such charter agreements? Each ship shall carry on board a ship security plan approved by the administration. If the language or languages used are not English, French, or Spanish, a translation into one of these languages must be included. Changes to the ship security plan or the security equipment that have been specifically approved by the administration must be documented. This approval shall be available on board and shall be presented together with the International. This course provides the training requirements set out under the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code in Parts A and B of the Code. The instruction will help to clarify the specific training obligations required by position, requirements for training, as well as who needs to be trained, what the training must consist of, and where the responsibility lies for the training of the various persons involved in the security organization. Also included in this program is a primer for the Port Facility Security Officer and the Ship Security Officer on the instructional techniques for security training and education. An essential part of the responsibility held by the Port Facility Security Officer and the Ship Security Officer is their respective obligations to provide training to their fellow employees or crew. One reason for the ISPS code requirement that the PFSO and the SSO have maritime security training themselves is to ensure that they are prepared to impart some of the knowledge to those that must also come to understand such things as the maritime security threat, the unique vulnerabilities of a port, and the security actions the ship or port must undertake during security levels 1 through 3. This program will provide you with both the training requirements required of ship and port personnel, as well as guidance on how best to provide such training. Bear in mind that training can include everything from imparting ISPS code requirements to preparing personnel for a drill or exercise. Let's start off with a listing of the training requirements for the company security officer and the ship security officer. These training requirements include an understanding of security administration, relevant international conventions, codes, and recommendations, relevant government legislation and regulations, responsibilities and functions of other security organizations, the methodology of port facility security assessments, methods of ship and port facility security surveys and inspections, ship and port operations and conditions, ship and port facility security measures, emergency preparedness and response and contingency planning, instruction techniques for security training and education including security measures and procedures, which is what we're learning now, handling sensitive security-related information and security-related communications, knowledge of current security threats and patterns, recognition and detection of weapons, dangerous substances, and devices, recognition on a non-discriminatory basis of the characteristics and behavioral patterns of persons who are likely to threaten security, techniques used to circumvent security measures, security equipment and systems and their operational limitations, methods of conducting audits, inspections, control and monitoring, methods of physical searches and non-intrusive inspections, security drills and exercises, including drills and exercises with ships, and the assessment of security drills and exercises. In addition to those training requirements, in accordance with the ISPS Code, Part B, Section 13.3, all ship's crew having specific security duties should have knowledge and receive training in some or all of the following as appropriate. Knowledge of current security threats and patterns, recognition and detection of weapons, dangerous substances and devices, recognition of characteristics and behavioral patterns of persons who are likely to threaten security, techniques used to circumvent security measures, crowd management and control techniques, security-related communications, operations of security equipment and systems, testing, calibration, and maintenance of security equipment and systems, inspection, control, and monitoring techniques, and methods of physical searches of persons, personal effects, baggage, cargo, and ship stores. Section 13 of the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code goes on to say that drills shall be carried out at appropriate intervals, taking into account the ship type, ship personnel changes, port facilities to be visited, and other relevant circumstances. The company security officer must ensure the effective coordination and implementation of ship security plans by participating in exercises at appropriate levels. There is also a requirement for the training for all other shipboard personnel, as described in the ISPS Code Part B, Section 13.4. These are the crew that do not have specific security duties. Their training should include the following: the meaning and consequential requirements of the different levels of security, such as MARSEC or security levels 1, 2, and 3. Knowledge of the emergency procedures and contingency plans for that ship. Recognition and detection of weapons, etc. Recognition on a non-discriminatory basis or characteristics and behavioral patterns of persons who are likely to be security threats. And techniques to circumvent security measures. The stated objective of this training is to ensure that shipboard personnel are proficient in all assigned duties at all security levels and the identification of any security-related deficiencies. Having looked at the training for the Company Security Officer, the CSO, and Ship Security Officer, the SSO, let's shift our attention to the training requirements for the Port Facility Security Officer, or PFSO. According to the ISPS Code Part B, Section 18.1, the PFSO should have knowledge and receive training in some or all of the following: security administration, relevant international conventions, codes, and recommendations, relevant government legislation and regulations, responsibilities and functions of other security organizations, methodology of port facility security assessments, the methods of ship and port facility. In this course, the purpose and contents of the security plan are clearly established and emphasis is placed on the issues of confidentiality. The primary course objective is to establish intimate familiarity with the contents of the plan and the processes by which the plan is developed, approved, implemented, maintained, and modified in accordance with the ISPS Code. In previous courses, we've looked at vulnerability and threat assessments as well as the development of a risk assessment program. The security plan is the blueprint that provides guidance to either a ship or a seaport on how to implement those steps necessary to address everyday security concerns as well as those risks associated with periods of heightened concern. The plan is always written following the completion of the security assessment. That assessment should include the threat assessment followed by a vulnerability assessment. With the information gathered from these two efforts, a risk assessment is performed that will, through quantitative or qualitative analysis, assign risk values that will aid in the creation of a prioritized risk mitigation program. That program will be articulated within the security plan. Indeed, the ISPS Code requires that findings from security assessments, including security deficiencies, be specifically referenced within the security plan. In the ISPS Code Part B, the Company Security Officer, or CSO, and Ship Security Officer, or SSO, must develop procedures to assess the continuing effectiveness of the SSP and prepare amendments of the plan subsequent to its approval. Let's talk specifically about the Ship Security Plan, or SSP, as it is sometimes referred to. In addition to these programs, you can find references to the creation of a ship security plan in documents other than the ISPS Code, including the Vessel Security Planning Guide issued by the U.S. Coast Guard, guidance for ship owners, ship operators, and masters on the protection of ships from terrorism and sabotage, written by the International Chamber of Shipping in 2001, the Model Ship Security Plan, provided by the Liberian Registry in April 2002, and U.S. Code of Federal Regulations 33 CFR Parts 104 and 105, Vessel and Facility Security. It's essential, however, that you understand the requirements spelled out in the ISPS Code. Section 9 of the Code details the elements of the Ship Security Plan, and it states that each ship shall carry on board a ship security plan approved by the administration. A security consultant or a recognized security organization, the RSO, may prepare the ship security plan on behalf of the shipping company. An RSO, if approved by the administration, may review and approve ship security plans and amendments, but it cannot both assist in the creation of the plan and the assessments and provide approval for such plans or assessments. Now, the plan must also be written in either English, French, or Spanish, and should also have a translation available in the working language of the crew. When drafting a security plan, it is important to take into account the guidance in Part B. Remember, several contracting governments, including the United States, intend to apply Part B as mandatory and not recommendatory. Therefore, in most cases, it is advisable to use Part B in all of your assessment and plan preparations. The ship security plan should include the following elements: measures designed to prevent weapons, dangerous substances, and devices intended for use against people from being brought on board the ship; identification of the restricted areas and measures for the prevention of unauthorized access; measures for the prevention of unauthorized access to the ship; procedures for responding to security threats; procedures for responding to any security instructions from contracting governments; procedures for evacuation in case of security threats or breaches of security, duties of shipboard personnel assigned to the ship, procedures for auditing the security activities, procedures for training, drills, and exercises, procedures for interfacing with the port facility, procedures for the periodic review of the security plan, procedures for reporting any security incidents, identification of the ship security officer, or SSO, the identification of the CSO, the company security officer, and details on the inspection, testing, calibration items. Security plans, obviously they are extremely sensitive and should be marked and controlled as such. Construction information such as plans, schematics, construction diagrams, schedules, and associated cost information. An example of that would be a client of ours that had actually spent a tremendous amount of money on the engineering and development of a security mitigation, risk mitigation program. They were looking at fencing, lighting, access controls, alarms, electronic access controls into all of their designated restricted areas, CCTV cameras. And they put a lot of conscientious effort into it, spent a lot of money. We're talking about millions of dollars. Once they had completed that and they were ready to start actually installing these systems, they had to go to bid, and they put everything in blueprints and provided them to the public so that anyone would have an opportunity to bid on the projects. And what they then managed to do in one action was to provide also a blueprint to an adversary to specifically identify the vulnerabilities and those steps that had been taken in order to mitigate those vulnerabilities and allow them to find alternative means to penetrate the port. This is not a good idea, and obviously controls have to be placed on such construction documents and bid documents, and there are several ways of doing that. But it's the sort of thing that you need to be thinking about as you move forward, particularly as you're making improvements to your physical security side of the house. Other areas that should be considered sensitive include photographs, maps, blueprints, drawings, and similar materials that depict sensitive seaport operating facilities. Seaport ship and security policies and procedures are also included in the category of information that must be protected. Results of seaport or adjacent facility audits, inspections, or critical self-analyses, including legal documents that you may receive from counsel. Information which is not generally known to the public and the release of which could reasonably be determined to jeopardize the security of the seaport. This could also include intelligence that you receive insofar as threat vectors that are directed against your port or your ship. Attorney-client privileged information, confidential employee information, of course, and that's of significance in the United States where there's so much tort law that is arrayed against any employer who fails to protect sensitive information relating to an employee. It's the responsibility of all seaport ship and contract employees and vendors to understand and comply with the policies implemented in the handling and processing of information identified as seaport security and law enforcement confidential. And again, that may not be the actual language that you use to identify your documents. And one of the benefits that came from the interim rule is that there was a finding that information that is developed through the assessment and conveyed in a plan indeed are special sensitive.
Introduction to Port and Ship Security Measures is the fourth and final module of Moxie Media's and C-Secure's training course entitled Introduction to Maritime Security and Anti-Terrorism.
Ship and port operations and conditions. Now, much of this is going to probably be information known to you. But one of the requirements of the ISPS code that in any certification course that we go over and provide a basic understanding of the general patterns and mechanisms of cargo and passenger movement through international and intermodal transportation chains, and how essential it is for those who are charged with enhancing maritime security to understand these programs. Operational interfaces between maritime and other modes are a central component of this segment of the course. The multimodal points of operational interface include cargo entry and control gateways, and for those we're looking at wheeled container cargo vehicles, wheeled local cargo vehicles, and railed container cargo. Also, cargo storage and transfer yards, vessel, road, rail container, and transloads. Fluid cargo transfer points, vessel, pipeline, storage tanks, wheeled and rail tank carriers. passenger entry control points, including port and tenant facilities, passenger terminal, and vessel entrances, and general and commercial aviation. Let's talk here about wheeled container and cargo vehicles. Cargo transiting a port should first enter through a vehicle access control gate and is the central point for controlling cargo vehicle access into the port's designated restricted area and ensuring appropriate physical, personnel, and information security screening measures are implemented. Collection and verification of the following data is important: identification of the driver, verification of credentials and port access requirements. Do they indeed have to be in the port at that point in time? Screening of the driver and passenger against security or law enforcement watch lists, which may become a requirement in the future, particularly if the MARSEC level increases. Confirmation of the driver's destination and identification and verification of the vehicle, cargo manifest information, cargo delivery point, and cargo recipient are all elements that have to be not only considered, but incorporated into your port facility security plan. The cargo entry or control gateway should be located at a point on the perimeter of the port's designated restricted area and be designed as an integral part of the port's physical security perimeter barrier. The gateway should be constructed with multiple lanes sufficient to facilitate the simultaneous processing of numerous vehicles into the DRA. It is important to remember that ports are engines of local and national commerce, and unnecessary delays or interruptions in the movement of cargo vehicles into or out of the port's cargo transshipment area will result in revenues lost to the carriers, port tenants, and the port itself. Container cargo vehicles that have a problem either with the driver's credentials or cargo manifest documentation or are just lost should be redirected to a problem resolution area. This area should be located outside of the port's designated restricted area where possible, although that sometimes is impossible given the configuration of gates and where they're located within the port, and provide a point where the driver may obtain the information or clearances necessary to facilitate the completion of an authorized delivery. It is imperative that the cargo entry control gateway be constructed of materials and in such a manner as to ensure a reasonable means of denying access or responding to a vehicle attempting to gain unauthorized entry into the designated restricted area. As an additional measure of security against the movement of contraband or destructive devices into the port, cargo container screening devices may be integrated into the cargo vehicle processing cycle. These may include CCTV monitorings of the cab and container identification numbers, and large format devices for X-ray scanning of cargo containers. The number and frequency of cargo containers being screened should be associated with the credible threat and the security level the port is operating under. Once inside the designated restricted area, wheeled cargo container carriers move to a cargo transshipment point where their container is removed for storage or loading onto a vessel. The driver may then be directed to receive another cargo container for delivery to a point outside of the port. The cargo yard may be operated by the port or by one of the commercial tenants, either of which is going to be obliged to put the operating circumstances into their facility's security plan. However, once inside the port's DRA, access into cargo yards should be segregated and subject to additional physical and personnel access controls and security measures, depending upon the nature and the value of the cargo being handled. Personnel security measures to be installed for use at the cargo entry or control gateway include an automated ID access control system with a biometric data validation capability. There should also be a means of automatically scanning and validating authorized visitor identification, for example, a driver's license, passport, or other state or federal government issued credential, and dispense sequentially numbered access passes for personnel and vehicles. These passes should have the capability of being scanned into the existing port visitor database for immediate visitor identification if required, and provide an audit trail of visitor entry-exit into the port's designated restricted area. We're going to talk about the vulnerabilities associated with visitor access controls a little bit later, but it's perhaps one of the single greatest vulnerabilities that face port facility security operators or port facility operators in the United States. Vehicles delivering small volume cargo or material.
Titled History and Current Trends in Maritime Terrorism.
Terrorist organizations have historically attacked maritime targets as a means of furthering their political goals. From the 1961 hijacking of the Portuguese-flagged PV Santa Maria to the hijacking of the Italian-flagged Achille Lauro
to the numerous maritime attacks by the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers since the 1990s, widely publicized maritime terrorism incidents have drawn immediate concern and attention. The October 2000 attack against the USS Cole demonstrated the destructive capability of contemporary maritime terrorists. However, analysis of maritime terrorism shows that it is not new and that it differs little, if at all, from terrorism ashore or in the skies. In fact, maritime terrorism occurs in many of the same forms and methods perpetrated ashore. For example, in October 2002, the Limburg-style attack used explosives that had been found in the same types of attacks that Al-Qaeda had used in Africa and elsewhere. And again, the methodology was the same. Use people that are willing to go up in the explosion so you leave no witnesses behind. Use explosives that can be easily put together wherever you happen to be operating. And do it in such a simple fashion that you leave very little chance to any type of mistake. And again, one of the hallmarks is that either people are going to be killed in the operation, or they're going to be so far away from the operation that they don't stand the chance of being captured by intelligence services and later potentially become witnesses to the state. The Al-Qaeda attack against the MT Limburg perhaps documents that an approach from the sea may be the present-day path of least resistance. The attack killed one Bulgarian crew member, discharged over 90,000 barrels of oil, and destroyed the ship. Abdul-Razim al-Nashiri, a close associate of Osama bin Laden and one of the top 10 al-Qaeda leaders, was arrested as he was fleeing Yemen for Malaysia following the CIA's Predator Hellfire missile strike November 3, 2002 on a car carrying 6 key al-Qaeda terrorists. You may recall that there was an American citizen in that car as well, who was later determined to be an al-Qaeda operative. This had the effect not unlike turning on the lights in your dorm room when you were in college and watched the cockroaches scatter, because what happened is after that attack, they knew full well that every al-Qaeda operative in Yemen was going to look for a place to hide. And indeed, they were scouring the borders to find people that were attempting to leave Yemen after that attack. Al-Nashiri was one of the principal targets of that. Al-Nashiri, who was al-Qaeda's director of operations in the Gulf region, has been giving CIA interrogators important information about a series of devastating attacks he was orchestrating against U.S. and Western shipping to the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. Those plots included plans to fly hijacked aircraft into U.S. and coalition warships and attack shipping with scuba divers and remote-controlled boats, according to sources that have been involved with the interrogations. A U.S. intelligence official has said that al-Nashiri gave investigators names of terrorists he personally recruited for these missions, as well as other important operational details. He was captured with a satellite phone and laptop computer that could yield even more information, sources have said. The FBI issued a number of recent alerts about shipping as a result of his interrogation. The severity of the attack against the Cole and the Limburg, coupled with reports of numerous attacks by suicide boats of the Tamil Sea Tigers against Sri Lankan naval forces, has prompted serious examination of terrorist maritime attack capabilities by the world community. This history of terrorist and maritime attack of particular interest to the U.S. Coast Guard has been the potential for terrorist assaults against a cruise vessel, and that's perhaps not difficult to understand. With over 5 million Americans traveling on cruise ships and ferries, making calls in over 200 ports around the world, it makes many opportunities for terrorists to find that most vulnerable portion of the cruise infrastructure where they could potentially lay a trap against either the ship, the port, or indeed persons that happen to be on shore excursion. These numbers could result in a significant terrorist event if an opportunity were to arise. Let's talk a little bit about the maritime terrorist threat in the United States. There is concern that domestic and international groups may take advantage of the events of 11 September to advance their agendas. The availability and ease of procurement of materials, for example, small boats, chemicals, etc., and freedom of movement in the United States make the threat plausible. This is a quote from Admiral James Loy, who at the time was Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard and is now heading up the Transportation Security Administration. And at this time and at other times where we've spoken to him, he himself has said that he believes one of the most significant vulnerabilities that we face is our maritime industry, both ships while at sea and in port, and the ports themselves. U.S. terrorist groups fall into 3 categories: right-wing, left-wing, and single-issue or special interest. Right-wing organizations include racist, patriot, and militia groups. Left-wing groups embrace traditional leftist revolutionary philosophies as well as anarchy. Single-issue terrorism involves groups or individuals who may identify with either end of the political spectrum, but who are only concerned with a single issue, such as animal rights, environmentalism, or abortion. While all of these categories represent threats, it is single-issue terrorism which appears to be on the rise. The majority of right-wing anti-federal government individuals or groups are not an active current threat to commercial or government maritime activities. There are many vulnerabilities inherent to the maritime arena that could be exploited by these groups. The emergence of the militia movement, for example, the constitutionalists, the free men, and patriots in the 1980s and 1990s raised concerns with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies as a minority of militia groups and/or individuals posed a significant problem. Literature on these groups has mentioned sabotage of transportation infrastructure, including rail and port facilities, as a means of attacking the U.S. government. Past militia targets have been federally controlled rather than private property. In the 1980s and the 1990s, there were several notable cases of domestic right-wing terrorist groups planning to attack maritime targets. In 1984, white supremacist Robert Matthews, who was the leader of an organization called The Order, was killed while federal agents attempted to arrest him. After his death, plans were found detailing his terrorist group's intentions to attack ships in Puget Sound. In Georgia, in 1995, 3 members of the militia group were convicted of attempting to blow up bridges. Over the last decade, a number of social issues have attracted radical elements that form militant core groups whose agendas include the use of violence as a tool to achieve their goals. This gives you a good example of the type of vessels that we're now facing with those various maritime activist operations, and there's no mistaking that this is not a pleasure craft. This looks more like a military craft. Animal rights, the environment, and abortion are all issues which have spawned the creation of such militant groups. In 2001, the FBI estimated that an eco-terrorist group, the Earth Liberation Front, was responsible for $37 million worth of property damage over 4 years. Targets of eco-terrorists have included government agricultural research projects and private sector targets. In 2000, the U.S. Coast Guard arrested animal rights activists and seized a vessel after attempts to disrupt the Makah tribal whale hunt off Washington's Olympic coast was taking place. Several protesters were injured during the confrontation after U.S. Coast Guard vessels were compelled to stop vessels from endangering a vessel carrying Makah tribal hunters by shouldering them away. The increasing willingness of eco-terrorist groups to engage in violence to achieve their ends and the increased number of incidents attributable to these groups suggests the possibility of a larger maritime focus in the future. Since each of the issues commonly associated with single-issue terrorism remains controversial, the threat from such groups will remain constant and may be expected to grow. Attractive targets for such groups include whaling vessels, chemical carriers, seaborne nuclear fuel shipments, and ships transporting timber and lumber products from primary forests. Let's talk a little bit now about foreign and international terrorist groups. Persons associated with international terrorist groups, both members and sympathizers, and state sponsors of terrorism, as designated by the State Department in the United States, reside throughout the United States. Several of these organizations, including Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Lebanese Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and Jamaat al-Fuqra, have well-developed infrastructures in the United States, including Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., Tampa, Dallas, and Miami. Their U.S.-based activities include fundraising, recruitment of new members, weapons training, bomb-making, robbery, extortion, counterfeiting, criminal activity, and operational planning. A small by these terrorist groups. In general, arms smuggling is most prevalent in Colombia. They're smuggled through ports in both the Caribbean and Pacific coasts. The maritime smuggling routes into Colombia are augmented by maritime transport to Venezuela and Panama, with further transshipment to the FARC and ELN via land means. Go-fast and fishing vessels commonly used in the South American drug trade are also used to move weapons. So you're seeing a cross-pollination between terrorists and those individuals that are involved in drugs. And as we know from FARC, which started off as a political movement to overthrow the government, a Marxist-Leninist movement, it's really now become just a paramilitary criminal conspiracy. Let's talk a little bit about piracy, because piracy is a far more significant issue than most people give credit. Maritime piracy events range from opportunistic boarding and thefts of ship stores to sophisticated hijackings of vessels at sea, requiring complicated logistics and pre-planned disposition of cargo by criminal syndicates. As you can see, one statistic holds that almost $16 billion a year is being lost to piracy alone. And that's probably underestimated because most of the incidents of piracy are never reported. This is the true face of piracy in 2003. Over the past several years, there has been considerable debate among concerned parties over the definition of piracy, and a workable definition remains elusive. We have to talk about some of those so that you can appreciate that there's going to be some confusion with regard to statistics. And some of the confusion is deliberate because the agencies or governments that subscribe to them have deliberately created these definitions so as to minimize the number of piracy incidents that are reported out of that country. The International Maritime Bureau, which is the IMB, is the internationally accepted data source for piracy events, and it defines piracy and armed robbery as an act of boarding or attempting to board any ship with the apparent intent to commit theft or other crime, and with the apparent intent or capability to use force in furtherance of that act. This definition thus covers both actual and attempted attacks, whether the ship is berthed, at anchor, or at sea. Petty thefts are excluded unless the thieves are armed. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, defines piracy as an illegal act against ships on the high seas or in a place outside the jurisdiction of any state. This was a political definition, and you can see why it might have been adopted by those countries that have significant amounts of piracy. The fact is, the number of successful piracy attacks that occur on the high seas is relatively low, and the reason being that ships are typically moving at greater speed. The sea conditions are more significant, and it's more difficult to be able to identify a ship on the horizon and be able to approach it successfully. Most of the incidents indeed occur close to shore or in port. The IMO, in a circular issued by its Maritime Safety Committee, endorsed a more expansive definition of piracy events. The Maritime Safety Committee's included in its definition of piracy events armed robbery against ships. And that's probably a closer approximation to what we ought to be looking at insofar as a viable definition. The IMO defines armed robbery against ships as any other act of violence or detention or any action of depredation or threat thereof against a ship or persons or property on board within a state's jurisdiction over such offenses. For purposes of our conversation here on piracy, the definition of a piracy event is an actual or attempted attack, whether the ship's at berth, at anchor, or at sea. So what are the trends in piracy that we can see? Well, here's a chart that shows that there has been some constancy, and the phenomenon that we are starting to see is that as assets and navies are being applied to one area, it's like squeezing a balloon, and the piracy shifts to other regions. We're also noting now that in areas in South America and Africa, increases due to instability with local governments of piracy are increasing as well. A total of 145 seafarers were reported killed, assaulted, kidnapped, or missing in just the first quarter of 2003, with bulk carriers nominated as the vessels most likely to face attack. Consider that number, in just 1 quarter of this year. Pirate attacks on ships have tripled in the last decade, with a reported 103 attacks in the first 3 months of this year. The number of attacks in the first 3 months of 2003 have already equaled the total number of recorded pirate attacks for the whole of 1993. Indonesian waters, as we explained, continue to be the world's most dangerous, with 28 pirate attacks recorded between January and March. We saw Nigeria also record a record number of attacks. 9 ships were attacked off Nigerian waters in the first quarter of this year, compared to 6 in 2002. Many of those attacks are occurring against resupply ships that are servicing the oil and gas facilities that are located along the coastal waters of Nigeria. It's also assumed that there is a measure of complicity with the government. Piracy attacks may occur in any location and at any time. However, most attacks occur at night in the vicinity of coastal waters due to the limited range and endurance of pirates' vessels and the ease of transfer of stolen items to escape ashore. In this graphic, you can see the distribution of attacks And in Africa, Nigeria stands alone as being most significant in the number of attacks that occurred in 2002, but we're fast exceeding the numbers that were reported in 2002 here in 2003. In this chart, we can also see the breakdown of the violent attacks committed by pirates. And the trend here is that where 10 years ago, the vast majority of piracy attacks were to seize paint and lines off of the aft end of a ship and toss it to compatriots in a small boat that might be trailing behind the vessel. Now we are seeing a propensity for the use of significant violence by pirates. And we're also seeing that they're far better armed than they used to be. It's no longer just knives and machetes, although a number of attacks are fairly unsophisticated. But we'll see here shortly that many of these are very deadly encounters. In addition to international organization efforts to combat piracy, the commercial shipping industry also took steps to protect itself. A number of companies have employed the CJAC alarm system. This system tracks a ship's position, course, and speed and alerts the vessel's owner if the system is disabled. Another apparatus being installed on vessels will signal when pirates attempt to use a grappling hook to board a ship. The device, a wire strung along the deck rail, sounds an alarm if the wire is stretched or broken. As you can also see in this particular illustration, they've even added a nuance to that where they have an actual electrified fence that surrounds the entire deck of the ship. The idea here is to stun the pirates after they attempt to board the vessel. But at least people are starting to think out of the box. They're looking at various alternatives. But systems are perhaps not the only way to cope with this. Other companies are offering armed response teams to retake hijacked ships regardless of location. It's not really clear how much commercial shipping industry's efforts contributed to the overall reduction of piracy that we saw 2 years ago. The increase probably is more attributable not to the lack of safeguards being taken by pirates, but rather by the increased conditions that have always stood as the incubus for creating the problems that spawn piracy, and that is later described in this lecture. Gurkha International Group and others are providing armed personnel to actually sail on board ships, the idea being that they can become almost an armed force then to help repel attacks. This is not recommended by the Maritime Security Council. It's not recommended by most governments, and it can create a lot of problems for the shipper. But for those vessels that are being repeatedly attacked, particularly those that are regionally based, it's one alternative to look at insofar as trying to mitigate the risk. The Petro Ranger, which was a tanker bound for Vietnam with a load of jet fuel and diesel oil, is a very famous example of what type of attacks can occur. It was seized by gun and machete-wielding pirates just a few hours outside of Singapore. Scores of hijackings of merchant ships now take place on the open seas every day, and this type of attack where actually it was probably an attack on order. In other words, somebody said that they wanted a consignment of oil, and the pirates went off and hijacked a ship in order to meet that order. And this is what's happening now with exchanges of information and the increased use of high technology by pirates to identify consignments and even identify specific containers that might be plundered while in port or at sea. Here's a breakdown of the attacks and where they occurred back in 2002 in the first half of that year. We need to talk now about a regional review of piracy activities so you can appreciate the context of some of these events, particularly as they relate to our own hemispheric activities. Let's first talk about Asia and Southeast Asia. Indonesia continues to be the most piracy-prone area in the world, with 91 of the 335 worldwide reported piracy incidents occurring in or near Indonesian waters. To combat this growing threat, the Indonesian Navy increased its patrols in the Malacca Strait and around Bataan Island.